So, welcome everyone. Today we are having a session of letters to my former self, and I am happy to introduce Adam Berner, also known as Lama Adam, who will be our guest tonight. Welcome, Adam, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. I'm really running with the letters to my former self thing. So I'm so grateful that you're all here, but I'm really taking care of one person today. And hopefully you all, it'll resonate with you as well. But I also want to encourage you to take care of yourself as you need to. If you feel like you need to turn your camera off, that's okay. If things are triggering things for you, feel free to tune out for a couple minutes, whatever you need to do. Just please take care of yourself because I know a lot of us have some similar experiences and this could bring some stuff up. So what I'd like to start with is a little anecdote. When I was working at Denison University, I had to take an anti-hazing training. If you work in academia, I think you're probably familiar with these online trainings you have to do. And this was very shortly after I'd stepped back from the temple I was working at, and when I was just at the very beginning of my recovery. And I took this test and it was you had to answer, are these things okay all of the time, some of the time, or never? And I can tell you that I answered some of the time to a number of things that were never, at least according to the training. And so I want to throw some of these at you today. So for instance, just think for yourself, all the time, some of the time, never. Assigning or requiring the use of new names, chronic sleep deprivation, pushing through injury or illness in the name of devotion, discipline, or purification. Restricted communication with family or outside support. Elevating faith over discernment, especially once with someone who is struggling. Denial of adequate medical care, including mental health support. Framing harm or ill health as the result of not practicing properly. Exposure to extreme temperatures. Creating financial dependence on a community or a teacher. Use of fear-based consequences, like breaking Samaya, hell realms, or reducing your teacher's well-being or vitality. Gaslighting, denying that somebody's lived experience is true. And lastly, discouraging exit, threatening or catastrophizing if someone wants to leave. We have to acknowledge that many of these are only considered acceptable when there is clear, informed, revocable consent, not implied consent under pressure, obligation, or spiritual coercion. And all of these things are things I've experienced, mostly in Buddhist and meditation communities, but I was also in a fraternity. So, to be honest, I went through a lot of this stuff twice. That's something I have to think about, I guess, that I've been open to those things more than once. Um, so I just want to frame there because as I started to put this talk together, I realized I had a whole lot of stuff, way too much stuff. I took all these notes for like a month and a half while I was thinking about this talk coming up, and I realized I had more than enough to fill the whole time with awful things, and I think interesting awful things. And I'm working on a book, so early plug. It will all be told at some point. But I also had more than enough to talk about that I felt was worthwhile lessons that could benefit people. And so I want to lean more towards the positive side of things. So I may gloss over some things today. We will have time at the end for questions. So if there are certain places where you feel like a yada, yada, yada through something that's important, just let me know and we can, I'm happy to talk about anything in the questions. So again, I'm framing this as really for me. This is a talk that I need. For a previous version of me needs this talk, and he's here today, and I'm going to take care of him. And so maybe there's a previous version of you that might benefit as well, And even if it's not today, I have to say that this process of thinking about taking care of a previous self has really been therapeutic for me. So I would encourage you to give it a try. And so why I'm here is, in a nutshell, because the last few years I've been recovering from meditation-related adverse effects, PTSD, and moral injury, which happened during my time in a traditional 3-year meditation retreat in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and while serving as the resident teacher at the Columbus KTC Meditation Center. And I will note that these were mixed experiences. I'm still incredibly grateful for my time in the 3-year retreat. No regrets about being there. And I'm still incredibly grateful for my time serving the Columbus KTC. The 3-year retreat, it turns out, was survivable for me. Columbus KTC was not. So while the pastoral care side of things was like a dream come true in that job, working with leadership turned out to be a nightmare of maltreatment, isolation, gaslighting, broken promises, financial manipulation, and much, much more. So I think the worst for me was having to stay silent about it. Because even though I knew the community would not be happy with what was happening, I feared and was often being reminded of the possibility of causing a schism in the Sangha. If you know much about Buddhism, you know that's one of the 5 acts of immediate consequence. It's as bad as killing a parent, you know? So that definitely leveraged me staying quiet. And so I found myself in this situation where my spiritual responsibility and my loyalty, my sense of what was right, was in a constant war with my experience. And my refuge had become my abuser. And it was an incredibly unsettling place to be. I can feel it right now just talking about it. So in 2023, after 3 years of service in a role that I was certain I was going to spend the rest of my life doing, I had to step back. And it felt very much like leaving an abusive relationship far too late. It's a decision that I'm proud of myself for making, even if it was a bit late, because it is when my recovery began. And even through the worst of things, and I think maybe this is what makes this a unique talk, even through the worst of it, I maintained some practice of mindfulness and meditation, although significantly modified. And my confidence in the Dharma has never wavered, even though the way I feel about Buddhism has definitely evolved. So, and I've remained a teacher of mindfulness and meditation and Dharma for the past 5 years in settings that are both religious and secular, and it's something I dearly love doing. So I've had a lot of time to process what's happened to me, and it has transformed the way I relate to mindfulness meditation, the Dharma, and Buddhism. But it's still a work in progress. You know, this is not, I would love to come today with a completed package with a bow on it. This is what happened and why and how we can all avoid it. But it's still a work in progress, you know. So uh, I do think that there's a lot here that can benefit people today. So I'd like to share screen here, if I could. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I want to talk first about what I'm not here to do today. So I am not here to convince you to become a Buddhist. I'm not here to convince you not to be a Buddhist. I'm not here to convince you to meditate. I'm not here to convince you not to meditate. I'm not here to convince you to change the language you use to relate to your own experience or to your practice. I'm not here to convince you to use any of the practices or frameworks I may share. You can decide freely if they seem relevant or safe for you. I'm also not here to impugn the character or of anybody or any organization, extract retribution, or air any grievances. Because I want to note that I believe in the good intentions of everyone I reference in this talk, even if those I reference may have been involved in one or another instance of harm or moral injury to me. And even if our involvement resulted in significant pain or inconvenience, I really feel like they were doing their best, and so was I. That's how I think about this. It may sound naive. That's how I work through this. So I try my best not to hold any grudges, but I admit it is a work in progress as well. And that's largely because I'm still experiencing and recovering from a lot of the negative effects of that harm. So what I am here to do is to tell you about my lived experience with meditation-related adverse effects, moral injury, and institutional betrayal. I am here to tell you how I currently understand, practice, and teach mindfulness, meditation, Buddhism, and the Dharma. And I am here to share methods and ideas I have about how we can make meditation and Buddhism safer and more effective for Western audiences. Now, please be aware that I will be making a lot of references to meditation and Buddhism, as a lot of my story is in that context. Also, be aware that I will be teaching some of the more authentic trauma-informed Dharma I learned through my challenging experiences and with the support of Cheetah House. And again, just please know if I sound like I'm getting excited or preaching, I'm preaching to previous me, like I'm not trying to convert anyone. And in fact, when people come to me and they say they want to be Buddhist, I always say, well, let's try a little mindfulness first, maybe. So that is not the mission. I just want to make that clear because we will be talking about some things in a Buddhist context. And I'd like to start out too by just a couple big ideas that we'll be talking about for today. The embodied middle way, which I think is a path inclusive of both resilience and resourcing. Moral injury, I want to explain that idea. Misspelled dynamics. Dynamics of moral distress and moral harmony. That'll be our middle topic. And then applications, dynamic complements of engaged practice. And a couple working definitions. I think this is important because I think a lot of this language has gotten too mysticized and too religiousized. And so, like, just for our talk today, can we agree meditation here is, in Tibetan, the word is gom, and the meaning is actually to familiarize or to get to know. So when I'm talking about meditation, I'm really talking about familiarizing or getting to know. So despite any impression we have that meditation requires something remote or performative or foreign, it's really something we've all done and we all do in various ways and various degrees, I believe. So you don't have to be a Buddhist to see why familiarizing or getting to know oneself could be beneficial. I also want to clarify about mindfulness. Here we're talking about that as meaning to recall or to recollect, which is also the meaning of the word smrti. So, which is where we get mindfulness from. And so this is really about recalling to stay present and to being compassionate, recalling our goals and our needs, recalling balance. And it has two aspects. It's projected out into the past and future, and simply recollecting or being present in the moment. And then Dharma. So Dharma, I use this term to really just mean the way things are, which I think is what it was actually intended to mean. So I don't feel like the Buddha invented it. And no matter who is teaching it or how it's being taught, it is only ever yours to personally become familiar with. It is only meaningful when it's met in our own authentic experience. And a Dharma teacher is only as effective as they are in empowering their students to discover it for themselves. You can't dictate someone else's Dharma, and no one else can dictate the Dharma to you. So that I want to distinguish from Buddhism, which is the religion developed after the Buddha's death as a means of teaching the Dharma. And being a religion, Buddhism in its many forms has developed a smorgasbord of beliefs and metaphysical claims like any other religion has. And one of these key beliefs is enlightenment, a state of perfected finality of potential. And that is a belief, it's a claim. It's debatable whether one even needs to believe in enlightenment to practice Dharma. But that's one distinguishing factor. And that's okay because religious beliefs and metaphysical claims are not Dharma. Buddhism is not Dharma. Buddhism is a pedagogy. That's how I see this. So while Buddhism may have usefulness for many people, it is not for everyone. And I think the simplicity of Dharma, meditation, and mindfulness is available to anyone who finds it useful. It's there to be tested for oneself, completely separate from Buddhism. If anything, the formal religious practitioners here, I think, are borrowing language that belongs to everyone and using it for their specific purposes. So we're talking primarily today about meditation, mindfulness, and Dharma, and I want to distinguish that from Buddhism. And I also want to start here with a quick overview of a practice I've developed for myself. So one of my main kind of mantras or practices is gently returning. And this is going to be the title of my Substack and my upcoming book. And to me, it gets at the core of life's practice. It's like a fundamental instruction. Some of you may recognize it from shamatha or basic mindfulness. It's like coming back to an anchor, such as the breath. But it's also like a practice on the macro and micro levels of time where we're moving through life with a goal, we get distracted from that goal, weeks later or months later, we return to that goal. So there's an intention we have, something we're trying to do, we get distracted, we come back. In a session of meditation that may happen repeatedly as we come back to the breath or another anchor, but I think we need to think of it on the big scale too, of like what our goals are, what we're trying to accomplish, what we want to be. So the returning to me here in gently returning seems to be pretty easy. That has come pretty easy for me. But the gentle is where it's difficult, and I found it is equally as important as the returning. So when I'm returning, when I'm coming back to me or to something, am I doing it gently? Am I doing it with care? Is it with frustration, anger, or resentment that I'm returning? Because when I return, or another thing is when I return, have I gone way far afield of what I was? So the return is like a long way, like a whiplash over a long distance quickly. Or am I noticing my departure, my distraction quickly? And then the return is pretty short. And to me, this is really the heart of why mindful practice matters. And for many years, I was returning, but it was not gentle. So the quality of the return, how I'm returning, I think is a major factor in how I perceive the quality of my life in general over time. Those returns we take add up. And when we're able to shift them towards gentility and compassion, our whole life can shift in that direction too. When the return is not gentle, I've learned it generally means one of two things. Either I have to work on my gentility, in this case, my self-compassion, or if a particular return seems to always be the opposite of gentle, aggressive, hostile, unpleasant, that may be a sign that it's not about my process. And it may be much more indicative of something I should not be returning to. And in that case, whatever I'm returning to is likely something I should let go of. And knowing when to quit and actually taking the leap to quit is something I've always had a hard time with. And much of the negativity I've found myself in during the years, my worst years working for the Dharma Center was negativity I should have let go of, and I should have left it behind. The return again and again was not gentle. And the anchor was not at all right for me. And that made for an awful experience. So returning here is to authenticity, returning to a sustainable path that honors who we are right now. And to talk a little bit about the embodied middle way, the reason I mention this is because I think what does the middle way really mean? We talk about this as being what the Buddha learned when he became enlightened. And I think people really nerd out on this and get into like, well, it's the middle way between ultimate and relative truth or materialism and nihilism. But sometimes those approaches just turn the most practical, personal thing into some esoteric bullshit. So for me, the embodied mind middle way is one that starts with our current situation, what my mind and body are telling me when I just listen. And the process of the middle way is, I believe, managing dynamic complements. And that's something we'll talk about in more detail later. I want to give just a quick comparison to the life of the Buddha here, because this is the context from which I learned this stuff. So if you know the story of the life of the Buddha, you have a story of two extreme phases of practice. You have a phase of like pure comfort fixation that ends, has a distinct ending. You have a phase of pure discipline and asceticism, which also has a distinct ending. So each of these phases of extreme practice were equally untenable, and they both had an ending. He tried both opposites approaches and neither worked. It was an either or and neither worked. And again, I don't know that this really happened, but as a parable, I think it's very useful, and that's how I'm introducing it today. So after completing his ascetic phase, he didn't know what to do. Like that's the way I see it. He had this great blessing of unknowing. It was a lack of certainty, and the presence of curiosity and compassion, which I believe are really our superpowers. So he was sure as hell not certain of anything, except that he needed to familiarize, to get to know, right? Familiarize, get to know, meditate, which he did overnight under the Bodhi tree. I believe what happened, why he awakened, was that he let his own experience be his teacher. So what he discovered was the middle way, and that's a path that balances extremes. It's a path that manages dynamic complements. And his story doesn't demonstrate the need to get rid of our comfort entirely, or only engage in challenge. Although I think that may be what a lot of people read Buddhism or Dharma as. I believe it demonstrates the value of really our two true superpowers, which are curiosity and compassion. And so I think the middle way really is knowing for ourselves when it's time for comfort, when it's time for challenge, when we're too tight or we're too loose, when we need an external teacher or when we need internal wisdom. And I think these complements act like the ends of a guitar string. Like these things are not in conflict with each other. They're what this thing is hung on, what our whole experience is hung on. So we need to get to know these poles so that we can have an accurate sense of what kind of balancing we need to do in the situation. And so another thing I want to teach today is I've developed a sort of three-step practice that I use pretty often. And it starts with a check-in with the window of tolerance. And this is something I think developed by Dan Singer at UCLA. I learned it through the trauma sensitive mindfulness community and Dr. Britton's work. And by the way, I could talk for 25 minutes about how impactful Dr. Britton's work has been on my life. We only have an hour, so just know I would love to talk about that for a half an hour for sure. But anyway, so the window of tolerance, I think, is a way of looking at balancing hyper-focused and hypo-focused. And we work with that dynamic complement, or as we call it in meditation lingo, agitation and dullness. And so when you do a check-in like this, you're checking in and you're pausing and noticing like the flavor of our mental state. We're noticing, are we feeling like a little agitated or a little spaced out? Because I think initially it's some sense of one or the other. And that's a little too either or. So what I think is cool is then we start to put it on a spectrum and we can start to see, well, I am feeling agitated, but I'm only really like a 6, or I'm only really like a 7. So it's starting to break apart the either or thinking and giving us some nuance in where we are on the spectrum. And that's important because we need to have a window, a safe window of when to proceed, when to challenge ourselves, because a lot of Dharma practice is challenge. A lot of meditation is challenge. There are also a lot of meditations that are specifically for calming down, but I don't think there's a lot of clarity around that. And even practices that are designed to calm us down sometimes can get us activated in ways that are unhelpful. So it's super important, I think, to always start with a check-in. Just check in on where you are. I think this aligns perfectly with the Buddhist teaching, to be honest, because we have these two extremes. And I think these two extremes map onto the window of tolerance. And so when we think of the idea of enlightenment, like a state of perfected balance, I actually I love this image of the Buddha, but I feel like I've been getting a lot of comfort lately from this image of the Buddha, because I feel like the Buddha has to have these two advisors, just like we have to know where our agitation and our dullness is, and our most agitated self and our most dull self, they inform each other. And so I think there is uh, we learn from those dynamic complements as we manage them. And I think of the window of tolerance like this. I think of it mapped on top of this parable of the Buddha's story. I think that, and to say this another way, I do not think Buddhism is trauma informed, but I think Dharma is inherently trauma informed. And I think Buddhism can move in that direction because this awareness, this familiarity of our situation in any given moment, I think is where this all starts. This is where the embodied middle way starts. So I want to jump over briefly just to tell you a little bit about the 3-year retreat I did. If you have questions later, we can dive into all of this. But the retreat I did was from 2016 until 2020. We were there for 3 years and 7 months. The retreat's supreme guide was Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, who's my teacher, um, and one of the most amazing beings I've ever met. And all the practices were taught by him, but he was rarely able to visit us physically at the retreat. He was getting older, and day-to-day guidance from our retreat came from our retreat master, who was an elderly Yupper from the Upper Peninsula who completed 4 3-year retreats in a row. And he is a super kind man, and there are things I admire so much about him. He cared very much about everyone's ultimate awakening, their perfection of their potential. But when it came to those struggling on the path, there's a lot of things I respect about him, and many of the decisions and things he said while I was in his charge were negatively consequential for me, and I was very relieved when I didn't have to answer anymore to him. Though, as I said, I do believe he's a deeply good man. So that was the situation in terms of instruction. We had no phone, no internet, no visitors, functional talking only during lunchtime, 9 months of complete silence. Our rooms are 8 by 10. We spend 18 hours a day in that room alone. 14 hours of the day is in practice, whether alone or in a group. We use our Dharma names. I was Jimpa for that whole time, never Adam. Um, and the retreat commitment is a big deal. It's like a really big deal, like the biggest deal spiritually. So I was told that leaving retreat in our tradition meant not being allowed back to the monastery or any of the affiliate centers, at least until the retreat ended, without you in it, and at least until it had completed. So we were warned in advance that if we had to leave, we would not only have catastrophically bad karmic consequences, including detrimental effects to the health and well-being of our teacher, but that we would also not, that we would be unwelcome for any kind of help in the lineage. So that was hanging over our heads. Um, and there were a lot of challenges and things that happened there. So I can tell you about a lot of stuff. Of course, time is ticking. I think what I want to focus on just briefly, because this is really why a lot of us are here, is the adverse effect I had. So retreat was to me an exercise in fundamentalism. It was my chance to really kind of go all in. And I feel, again, like I kind of needed that. I needed to know where the goalposts were. I definitely knew how to just do whatever. So to kind of really dive into a serious discipline and program, I'm grateful for that experience. So it was, especially for the first half, pedal to the metal for me. Push on through, sacrifice it all for awakening of all beings. And I really felt for the first half that I'd done about as perfect a retreat as I was capable of. I was pushing through all kinds of discomfort, keeping the schedule, just really totally immersing myself. And honestly, I was learning to ignore all kinds of signals coming from my brain and my body about my well-being. I was utilizing these practices as a way to mute self-awareness, not cultivate it. And I think this is something that happens very, very often. It's something we have to watch out for. So I'll tell you, the day of my adverse effect, it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful sunny day in the Catskills. And I was having some of the best practice of the whole retreat. We were doing a practice that involves breath retention. And I don't think I'm telling anything that anybody can't find out very easily. But breath retention is something that happens a lot in tantric practices. Breath retention is a nice word for holding your breath longer than you're comfortable with. And and I want to say this is something we did a lot of the retreat. And it's only recently as I was preparing this that I realized that doing that kind of a practice, effectively holding your breath for much longer than you're comfortable over and over and over, experientially elevates anything you're doing to a life or death situation. You know? I mean, and it vastly increases the chance of traumatic activation. I mean, I'm not a scientist. We can ask people who are here to confirm that, but I'm pretty sure that we're really putting people in a position that is precarious. But it was a practice I loved. The practice we were doing, I loved it. In fact, it was I think it was one of my best days in the whole retreat. It was the secret practice of Vajrayogini for people here who know. And and so I was doing this practice, and all of a sudden, something snapped. I think many of you here probably knew exactly the phrase that was coming because I've heard that phrase so many times with people who have adverse effects of meditation. Something snaps. You know, it doesn't always happen that way, but there's something just in it. It's all different. And so for me, it was a wave of fear and dread swept over me like nothing I'd ever felt possible. I was horrified about everything and nothing. I was sweating. I could feel my heartbeat. I could see my heartbeat in my eyes. I was all of a sudden worried about my mom. Like, did something happen to her? Is this like what happens when somebody have this telepathy between family members? You know, what is this? Did something happen to me? Did I meditate myself into insanity? You know, like I started having these conversations with myself, and I'd learned almost 5 years later in a very different setting, in a consultation with Dr. Britton, that what I experienced is one of the most common adverse effects of meditation, non-referential fear and terror. I didn't even know that was a thing. No one in the Buddhist community had ever told me that non-referential fear and terror was a possibility in my meditation practice. Yet it is one of the most common side effects of meditation. How did I not know that after 9 years of practice and being fully immersed in the highest level of meditation training? So it's easy to understand where that non-referential fear and terror comes from when you consider what happens when one has a genuine material reason to be terrified. In that instant, mind and body mobilize to meet that threat, and amongst other things, tightly sharpen your concentration. So it turns out when we spend a lot of time willfully creating a very tightened concentration, a very sharp concentration, sometimes the mind and body catch up and go, what's going on? And all of a sudden we're in this state of fight, flight, or freeze. And it can happen in the blink of an eye. Something just snaps. And so there were a lot of things happening in the retreat. I have to kind of blast through these, but there were situations about fire safety. Before I went to retreat, I had our temple, our home temple had burned down. And had lost two friends' homes to a fire. So fire safety was on my mind, and I got to retreat, and there were like two smoke detectors in the house, and neither of them were in the kitchen or the laundry room. And then even the shrine room where we burn oil lamps 24 hours a day, I begged to put a smoke detector in there, but I was told it would be unsightly. So that was on my mind. Also, we had a mouse infestation. Mice were shitting in the toaster, in the silverware drawer, in the napkin holders. We had two different kinds of mice in the house, which is a sign of a serious infestation. They don't usually live together. And one of the mice we had carries this virus that's 30% fatal when humans get it. And so I was constantly trying to get us to take care of that. We started live trapping them, but nobody would take them out and release them because they felt bad releasing mice in the woods in the wintertime. So I would trap them in the house. I would take them as far as I could, 10 feet to the fence around the house, and release them. If you know anything about mice, they probably came right back in. But that was all I could do. I felt like I had to do something. And I initiated these conversations around fire hazards and around mice chewing through wires and potentially starting fires. And nothing happened. And then towards the very end of the retreat, we had a fire caused by mice chewing through electrical cord. And it happened luckily right on a break because it was in the shrine room where we weren't allowed to put a smoke detector. It happened to happen right on a break when somebody was walking by. And this fire was up 2 stories up. It almost made it to the taffeta and brocade things circling the top of the room. And when the fire department came, they said if it had gotten there, the house would have gone up in flames. And they said you were about 30 seconds away from a catastrophe. So we were very, very lucky. And I can tell you that, the way that was handled was indicative of a lot of things because we were told that that probably happened because of the quality of our practice, that the local spirits and the protectors were upset with us for how we'd been practicing. Literally, that's what was said. And I remember that came up, and I remember one of my retreat mates who was also a little outspoken. And he said, "So they tried to burn the house down?" And we were told, "Yeah, yeah, that's probably it." So to come back to the adverse effect, luckily I had a Lama Yeshe, who was another retreatant, was in the retreat. And he gave me the advice that I think is exactly what Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche would have given me, which was to do what you need to take care of yourself. And it was interesting because in the retreat, people always have physical modifications they need to do, or, there's various reasons why we all need different kinds of meditation. And so it would always be like hemming and hawing if there was a question about, well, can we change this thing? Or I have this need. But when Rinpoche would come, he would always say, yes, if you need to do that, that's what you need to do, or you can do this. He was clear-eyed and compassionate, I think, about everybody's needs. And then I think everyone else was a little too hooked on the certainty or repeating what another teacher had said. So I'm really glad that I had Lama Yeshe there that day to tell me to do what I needed to do to take care of myself, because I started to return to me. I started to return to what I needed. I started to return to my nervous system, the signals I was getting. And still, the anxiety that adverse effect kicked off continues to echo through to this day. It's not anything I had before then. And I've gained a lot of skills to manage it, but it's still here. It's recovery, right? It's a process. And so the second half of the retreat, I began balancing the challenge of the retreat with an embodied mindfulness. And I got better at finding my balance. I started getting more sleep. I started going to bed early. waking up late. I started exercising. I was running a 5K around the house on the little track around the house, every day in lunchtime. If there's a pearly gates when I get up there, I'm asking how many times did I do that loop. So I'd never been a runner. Started running, started doing interval training, doing strength training. I'm still doing practice too, but I started doing things to take care of myself. I had my mom send me contraband. Thanks, Mom. My mom sent me like books by Robert Caro and Ansel Adams photo books. And sometimes I would just read or look at pictures. So I was really beginning to honor my inner wisdom, and I returned to my inner wisdom, to my authenticity. And I got better and better at it. But it was not gentle. And that's why I want to bring up this gently returning. Instead, I felt ashamed the whole time. I felt like I had to hide it. I was super paranoid because of the meditation related adverse effects and because I was taking care of myself in a context where I was receiving messages that taking care of yourself is bad. I mean, literally, there was a time where the retreat master said, I'm not happy that you run. And I said, I don't care what you feel about my running, you know? I mean, that was building. That wasn't like the first conversation, but those kind of things happened all the time. We were getting this kind of messaging that was just pushed through. That's the way to do it. And if you don't do it, the protectors will burn the house down. So I was also having a ton of surprise, superstitious anxiety. I'd found myself in this whole new Tibetan worldview where local spirits, protectors, and demons are around and they want you to do stuff. And I was deeply worried about what they would think of me not doing the prayers and practices exactly as I had been told to. If I wasn't giving them the offering they were supposed to get. I even started getting afraid when I did do the stuff, like they're going to be mad I didn't do it yesterday, and here I am doing it today. So there would be thunderstorms sometimes, and we'd hear that's Mahakala that was mad or disgusted with us. So even though this sounded ridiculous to me, it also impacted the part of me that really wanted to try this path fully. So on some level, I also allowed myself to believe it. Not so much on the surface, but I wouldn't say it to others, but it impacted me a lot. And it led to some serious paranoia that really had me riddled with anxiety and fear, even while I was taking care of myself. It put self-care against, practice. And I don't think that should ever be the case. Um, so to apply the middle way here, the embodied middle way and the window of tolerance, the retreat was a revelation for me because it gave me a much better idea of where the goalposts actually were on the field between fundamentalism and embodied realism. So fundamentalism might be a useful practice for oneself, but only the individual ultimately knows if at that point in time, that's what they need. Fundamentalism and fundamentalist views should never be forced on another, and they maybe even shouldn't be suggested. Fundamentalism is an extreme path, and if we're applying an extreme remedy, there better be an extreme malady we are counteracting. It only makes sense, right? So I mean, the most basic teaching of meditation in Buddhism, the life of the Buddha, it's all about not going to extremes. It's about staying curious and compassionate. Fundamentalism and Dharma practice do not mix. This is my belief. When one is there, the other is gone. But fundamentalism is right at home in Buddhism or any other religion. And that should tell us something about the difference between the two. So now I want to jump into we're definitely going to have to cut some stuff today, but I want to jump into that's okay. Got a lifetime of stories to tell. So I want to jump into moral injury briefly because this is a topic that not a lot of people know about, and learning about this has really helped me. So moral injury is a somewhat clumsy name for the frequent lesser known companion of post-traumatic stress disorder. And Jonathan Shea's definition is when there has been one, a betrayal of what's right, two, by either a person of legitimate authority or by oneself, and three, in a high stakes situation. So there is moral injury when there has been betrayal of what's right by a person of legitimate authority or by oneself in a high stakes situation. So to compare a little bit, PTSD mainly lives in the nervous system as helplessness and a need to reestablish safety. Moral injury, though, lives in like the metaphorical heart. It's some mixture of shame and guilt and disgust and betrayal that can only be relieved by reestablishing meaning, self-worth, and moral equilibrium, often through spirituality, mindful practice, and shifts in worldview. So when PTSD is present, it's likely that moral injury is too, and vice versa. And I also want to note that treatment outcomes, what I've learned is that treatment outcomes are best when chaplains work together with therapists on moral injury, because recovery from moral injury has so much to do with meaning making. And that's often the realm of the spiritual. So the underlying dynamic of all of this is that there is this dynamic complement of moral distress and moral harmony. And moral injury is an extreme case of moral distress. And that dynamic complement, getting to know when our moral operating system is in harmony or in dissonance with our situation, and to what degree, is something we can familiarize ourselves with. We can get to know that. And an awareness of the degrees of moral harmony or distress we're experiencing in any given moment is the first steps towards avoiding the shock of moral injury. The second step, I think, is cultivating a lighter grasp on our views and our expectations and the resilience to not let them go when we do meet dissonance. And this is a delicate process. It's a delicate process because what we consider the best of us, our values and our standards and our sense of meaning and place in the world, are exactly what can become our greatest vulnerability in the face of moral dissonance. And I will also add that I think that another reason this is important to know is that there are people who are collectively weaponizing moral injury against us right now. You know, there are people who are using our values and our sense of what's right to meet to kind of with such cruelty and shock to try to turn our values into a Trojan horse to kind of attack us from the inside, wear us down, make us give up. So I think this is a really important dynamic to know about moral injury and to watch for, because we can manage it. We can nurture this garden of our values and what matters to us. But the dissonance that happens when the external world doesn't match can, it interacts with our moral operating system. And so we need to all kind of have some sort of strategy for working on that. Next, because I'm running through this three-step practice, I want to give a quick overview of a twofold intention. So if you're doing the window of tolerance and you've done that and you've gotten your data, using that data of where you are on that window of tolerance spectrum, you make an immediate practical intention that aligns with your what you just learned from your window of tolerance assessment. So you're making a intention based on where you are right then. And then you connect that with a broader altruistic intention that's reflective of your highest values and aspirations and the wish to benefit others beyond just yourself. So you're kind of taking what you've learned, like you might learn, I'm outside my window of tolerance right now. So I'm not going to do a challenging practice. I'm going to take a nap. And then you say, because I want to help people, and I know if I take a nap, I'm going to be much better able to help the people around me. It could also be I'm at a 7 on the scale, so I'm a little agitated, but I'm in my window. I think I'd like to do some practice to work on my resilience here. Because I'm at a 7, I'm not going to do a practice that involves concentration. I'm probably going to do something that has a little more openness or spaciousness to balance things out a little bit. And then we connect that to our intention. So I can tell you that this for me is this kind of is refuge. You know, this is a refuge practice to me. This is taking refuge in our inner wisdom. And so while I still sometimes do the 4-line Sanjay Chidong prayer, if you know from Tibetan Buddhism, the refuge prayer, if I do that, I always do this first anyway, because I want to get in my own words where I am right now, what I'm doing in an informed way, and then to connect that to my sense of purpose. There's all kinds of research that being able to connect the things you're doing with a sense of purpose is beneficial. And so the more often that we can kind of do this practice. So the third step really here is just acting. So, we check in, make a twofold intention, act. And to me, this is kind of this is what I'm trying to gently return to again and again and again, staying connected to what's going on, what I need, being clear about my intention in the moment and connecting that to my bigger goals and aspirations, and then acting, and acting could be doing, could be being, could be either one. So I think this is a really useful full practice. It has been for me. And so just to throw some connections here to moral injury and my experiences in retreat, I mentioned about the mice, I mentioned about the fire, all of those, the fire safety kind of stuff. You can see how these in the context of intense spiritual practice might cause post-traumatic stress, but you can also see how moral injury might be implicated in these situations. Um, Similarly, thinking back on the people who left the retreat and how they left invokes some moral injury for me because these departures were never, ever pretty. People cracked, and we all cracked in one way or another. Some of us stayed, and some of us left, and maybe it was for the better or the worse that we stayed, but many of us opted in. And when I think of the state of some of those people when they left, and know that it would likely be the last time we'd ever see them. And they were on their own after this incredibly unique and incredibly challenging experience. That hurts. And I didn't realize it at the time, but almost certainly in retrospect, they were suffering from any number of the 57, 59, I don't know how many adverse effects that Britt and Lindahl and the others have documented. And these people needed help. And I hope some of these people found their way to Cheetah House. I haven't seen any of them here. So there's also the demonizing of self-care, giving us trouble for exercising or taking care of ourselves, making us feel like lesser for modifying something, like the hierarchy of practices. This is the best way. If you need to do it this way, it's not quite as good. But if you think about it, if there's only one way you can do a thing, that's the best way to do it. So to say like this is the best way and this is a lesser way, that's kind of universalizing when we should be engaged in person-centered care, a phrase I learned from Cheetah House and I love. So I just want to note once again that I never heard Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche deny anyone what they needed for their practice, my teacher. But so many other teachers were afraid to authorize modifications. They were afraid to give person-centered care. And so I'm still skipping through some stuff because I'm thinking about time here. Yeah, so I'm going to jump ahead to managing dynamic complements. And so what I mean by dynamic complements, I'm still looking for, I'm kind of liking dynamic complements. I have a whole list of terms that I'm trying out to kind of name these things. What we're referring to here are things we might call obstacles or oppositional forces, but I don't think that's the right way to talk about this stuff at all. As I said earlier, like tightness and looseness, we can say those are obstacles, but when you're a little loose, you need a little tightness, right? That's how you balance. So I don't really like the idea of like thinking of these things as oppositional or things that need to be eradicated. Let's put the two phases of the Buddha's life next to the Buddha and let them inform him. So a dynamic complement is something that requires constant attention, constant balancing. The tension is what makes them work. And we need to get people thinking about dynamic complements on the organizational level. So there's personal levels, tight and loose, agitated, dull. But on the organizational level, we need to get people thinking about dynamic complements if we really want to move mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhism towards a more trauma-informed, more inclusive Dharma. And one of the things I came up with to do this for my nonprofit Mindfulness for Life, we're going to be doing a series of programs called Dharma Deathmatch. The idea is putting two oppositional ideas or seemingly oppositional ideas in the ring, let them fight it out and see if we can find a middle way. But it's also to really kind of highlight some of these things that we may not talk about as much. So for a little context, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, until about 80 years ago, the amount of people meditating was a lot less. And in fact, most culturally Buddhist people, I'm thinking particular of Tibet, but I think it applies elsewhere too. Most culturally Buddhist people were not doing full sadhanas, with creation and completion. They were doing mantras, they were making offerings, visiting temples. If they were doing full tantric practices, they were doing it in the care of a teacher, probably at a monastery. It was a very specific and very different kind of setting for meditation. And we're now in the situation where meditation practices are so widely available. So, one broad thing we could talk about with these complements is just access versus safety, and I've been thinking lately, I did some research while I was looking this up about the OxyContin and Purdue Pharma situation from like depicted in the Painkiller movie. And also I was thinking about Britain and the opium that Britain brought to China. And I was thinking about how, also about all these people that I've met, and I know a lot of people here have met who have had these really bad outcomes with Kundalini practice or any of these high level tantric practices. It's definitely not limited to Kundalini, but that's one of the places where I've seen people have serious psychological breaks. And so I think the reason I bring up the opium or the OxyContin thing is because in both cases we have something incredibly powerful that is now placed in a population that may not be ready for it. And it may be causing a ton of problems. And this is a new situation. The Dalai Lama, I can't remember how long ago, but he said, we need to make these practices more available or else they'll go away. And so we are kind of preferencing access over individual safety right now. And I think that at least that, whether you agree or not, I think that dynamic complement is one we should be aware of and that we should be working with. And the three-step practice that I mentioned is a way of working with that. So, another one we can talk about is cultural fidelity versus cultural relevance. So, for instance, is access or safety, or is access or preservation eclipsing safety and efficacy of the meditation for students? One would hope that helping people reveal Dharma for themselves would always be the driver at a Tibetan Buddhist center. But I believe an equal and sometimes more important motivation is often preservation of Tibetan culture. And I think that's an important thing to examine or think about. Uh, we need to be aware of it at least because it is a factor in decisions that are being made. And I think sometimes it is the driving factor. Also, there are so many cultural artifacts in Tibetan Buddhism and many other lineages that are not required for the practice of Dharma. They're not required for a practice to be effective, but they become conflated with Dharma because they are the methods of that particular lineage of Buddhism and the culture from which it arose. So these implied viewpoints and judgments and rituals are deeply entwined with the teaching of Buddhism, and Buddhism is deeply entwined with the teaching of Dharma. And we need to be able to discern these dimensions of the teachings as best as possible. So some examples from my talk today, local spirits and superstitious paranoia. I was freaking out about these demons and spirits, and that wasn't a sign that I was a bad Dharma practitioner. It was a sign that that cultural artifact did not serve me. But I didn't see it that way then. I thought something was really wrong with my practice. But now I look back and I see, oh, that was just that was a cultural artifact that was not serving me, was not serving my practice of Dharma, was not helping. And this bears repeating because I think this happens to so many people in so many different ways. They get hung up on one or another of the cultural aspects of the practice, and they think their disinclination to believe in it is a failure of Dharma practice. And that's a shame. So another one is leveraging nascent learned beliefs in rebirth to control and keep people in a lineage or practice. So a phrase I've probably heard a lot of times, many of you probably have too, is think of all the hard work and aspirations you must have done in countless previous lifetimes in order to have the unique good fortune of being here today in this center, in this lineage. You wouldn't want to waste that, right? So this is almost like a guilt trip into both committing to the lineage and believing in rebirth. It can be manipulative and potentially dangerous, and it strips students of agency. Another thing I'd like to talk about is cultural veils and the credulity gap. So this is one of my favorite ways to explain cultural context and why it matters. It's difficult and time consuming enough to have students come to the understanding that we have a natural ability to be present and compassionate with whatever we meet. That's a core assumption of meditation. It's a core assumption of Buddhist practice. When we pile on top of that already difficult thing, a bunch of foreign cultural beliefs, such as belief in local spirits, rebirth, and other things, we tax the student's ability to believe. We incur a credulity gap with them, meaning the student may spend some of their credulity trying to come to understand and internalize cultural artifacts of the pedagogy, as opposed to spending that credulity on the most important and applicable thing, which is recognizing their natural ability to be present and compassionate through their own unique experience. And this is, in my opinion, a major impediment to the learning of Dharma in the West. I've also heard in these meetings how if one learns meditation in their cultural context, they're less likely to have adverse effects. So the more outside of our cultural context we are, the more likely adverse effects are. Next, cultic language and tendencies. They creep up in any religion, but especially in Tibetan Buddhism and meditation communities, as we start to use these foreign words and words with unique use cases in meditation practice. And again, we just need to generate awareness of the potential overlaps of a cult and a spiritual community, and how one's own interpretation and the modes of engagement may be the biggest determinant of what we experience, whether we experience it as a cult or as a spiritual path. It's much more than language, though, because there are many things that skirt the lines of cult-like techniques, and Dharma centers, as well as their students, should all be aware of this dynamic, even if it is inadvertent. Both the center and the attendees should always be aware in managing the potential dynamic in a healthy way. And last, consent and control. So the thing that stood out to me from the mindfulness and neurodivergence talk a few weeks ago was there was a question, and I would love to see if there's things that Dr. Britton or Dr. Birtwell have thought about since then. Someone asked, are meditation-related adverse effects acquired neurodivergence? And we were talking, and that question was spurred by the idea that neurodivergence can be acquired. And so it's really had me thinking, is all meditation acquired neurodivergence? I think it's an interesting question. I think it's quite possible, you know. I mean, we are changing our brain. There is science that we're rewiring the brain. So because we're rewiring the brain through meditation, is it acquired neurodivergence? It's something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. And this has been stuck in my head because, like so many of the other dynamic complements we went through earlier, this is maybe something practitioners should know about. And that's why I think one of the most simple ways to talk about how we can take mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhism into a safer, more trauma-informed direction is through informed consent. Clarifying what all a practitioner is consenting to is also vitally important. And we covered a lot of it today, but this talk was more about more than just informed consent. So to actually implement informed consent in a meditation group or a Dharma center would take a lot of discussion and precision, and that's probably a whole other talk. That's probably something I should develop. But so consent is a key to making ourselves vulnerable and open to change. And there are perfect metaphors here for sex that are quite apt, such as when something happens when consent is not invited, and we look back with mixed feeling or pure regret after the fact. So one of the simplest forms of genuine support a meditation community can offer is to simply remind its community members again and again that meditation-related adverse effects are very possible, and that practitioners at any level should be connecting with their own experience in every moment to know when a practice is the right match for them and when it's not. This is where the window of tolerance, the three-step practice I described can be useful. And also people need to know that a massive increase in anxiety might be because of their meditation and not something that requires even more meditation to overcome. How many people have ended up on that path? This is a damaging cycle that can develop when meditation centers do not name the risks and empower their students to know when it's time to change or stop a practice. The final authority should be clearly placed with the individual doing the practice. And this needs to be made clear again and again. Extreme hierarchy disempowers individuals into patterns of following and emulating, and it crushes authenticity. Trusting experience is really the ultimate teacher. And there's foundation for this even in Tibetan Buddhism. We have a Lojong slogan of the two authorities, trust the primary one. You know, whether it's what other people are saying or you, trust your experience. So no one should be remotely afraid to talk about the meditation-related adverse effects, informed consent in meditation spaces, improved meditation facilitator training, or any of the productive tensions between dynamic complements. That is the raw material for our improvement and our growth. And the presence of meditation-related adverse effects really only serves to demonstrate how powerful meditation is. So we should be more than willing to talk about it because powerful things can be good or bad. And if we're going to say it's so powerful, we have to recognize, like anything powerful, you know, what's the Spider-Man saying? It comes with great responsibility, great power with great responsibility. So power can create and it can destroy, and how it's wielded matters. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. Just to wrap up, I really came back to meditation through scaffolding. So this, I think, is like the one sort of modality that Cheetah House shares, as far as I know. And I saw it as recognizing what shamatha, or calm abiding meditation, was really for. It's a fantastic applied practice of mindfulness to me. It's like controlling the switches on your train tracks, you know, so we're always coming to these junctions of challenge and comfort. And I think scaffolding helps us wake up to when, first of all, when we arrive at one of those junctions. And second of all, it gives us agency to choose the direction we want to go. And this to me is just like noticing distraction and choosing to return, gently returning. So at any given moment, if you're heading for something challenging or something nourishing, you know, and you get to pick. This is very much like the mindfulness of feelings in the four foundations of mindfulness that we talk about in Buddhism. In that case, we're turning towards feeling tones, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. But here we're talking about noticing comfort or challenge. And we might notice, oh, this feels a little challenging. And we can decide, am I in my window of tolerance? Is this a challenge I should work with right now because I need it? Is now the right time? Or would it be better for me to take on this challenge later and right now and gauge some sort of comfort or resource? So from learning to scaffold, I started using sensations as an object of attention a lot more. The seminar with Dr. Farb about the sense foraging practice and his book, Better in Every Sense, was very helpful. I started developing my three-step practice based on trauma-sensitive mindfulness and Cheetah House things. Uh, and and eventually, you know, I came to where I was feeling pretty good. And I just want to wrap before we open up to questions. I love the Cheetah House community, and it's been through this past year that I've really started to feel like a member, you know, of this community, and I'm so grateful for that. I've needed that. And I'm also going to say, I don't know if everybody's going to be happy to hear this, but Cheetah House is Vajrayana AF. For real. I mean that in the best way, because Vajrayana approach is taking the fruition as the path. That's the tantric, like Tibetan Buddhist approach. And similarly, when we're able to tune into our nervous system, you know, monitor our window of tolerance and make practical, precise choices that support our broader altruistic goals, and then act in that way again and again and again, that is taking the fruition as the path. And I have felt at home with Cheetah House because it feels to me like a community of people who are becoming brilliantly uncertain, finding their way in each moment through engaging their own experience with curiosity and compassion. And I think those are our two true superpowers. And I see this alive in the people I meet in Cheetah House community. And I'm so grateful to Dr. Britton and everyone on her team and all the others working on this incredibly important mission. Um, I just think it's so important, and I'm surprised that they're kind of the only ones doing it. So I'm really grateful. And I will just say I have a nonprofit called Mindfulness for Life. I founded Mindfulness for Life to try to solve an issue I've been facing all along, which is how do you serve people for free and fund it that has been, I didn't talk much about my time at the Dharma Center today, but that was really the heart of that. I stayed for a long time trying to find a sustainable path of being able to serve people for free. The reason I left was because of a lot of other things, that I listed earlier. But that was, I'm still trying to solve that problem. How can I help people without the motivation of financial reward, and make that sustainable? I can tell you it's still a major struggle. I'm always like 2 weeks from a financial cliff, and I am right now. So, if you want to support our initiative to help immigrant and refugee service workers, this would be a great time to support Mindfulness for Life. And this is the first time where I'm piloting my new mindfulness-based moral injury prevention program, which I developed as a capstone of my moral injury certificate program. And I think there's something really important there. They use mindfulness as a treatment for moral injury, but nobody's been using it as a preventative. And if you know anything about mindfulness or meditation, it's probably good to work with that stuff beforehand if you're in a situation where there's likely to be moral injury. So, yeah, I think I got out everything, almost everything I wanted to say. There's so many other stories, but let's open it up to some questions. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't drop too much on you. Wow, that's a great question. It's very thought-provoking. I feel like I'll have a really good answer for that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, but I'll try right now. Um, I think in both cases, I'm sure part of it was some kind of uniqueness, a desire for some kind of uniqueness, being a part of something that maybe other people aren't. Um, I know I started writing something the other day about like why did we do the 3-year retreat? And I think if you had asked anybody, like they probably would say, well, to gain enlightenment, to benefit all sentient beings, but that's a little learned. I think a lot of that is like learned behavior, and I think in both cases, what I think I would probably an underlying dynamic was what I think is one of the main addictions of most people, which is certainty. Like I was going for some kind of certainty, like the fraternity is a brotherhood, brothers forever, like it's a thing that we become a part of and then it's done and we can shut down and go to sleep. And I think it was kind of the same with retreat. It was like I'll go to retreat. I definitely wanted to learn to have that experience with meditation and to dive into the practices, and all that was there too. But I think one underlying factor was like I'll have the whole rest of my life figured out. I know exactly what I'm doing for the whole rest of my life. And another thing I didn't dive into today, I also had the idea that dana, generosity, dharma generosity was how these organizations ran. And in my experience, that's not how it worked. If the Buddha taught, he would be given shelter and a meal and, he was taken care of. And in my experience, that's not how things work, at least in my American Dharma organization. And I think, and honestly, like I could say a lot about that, but I think that that is a point of like internal rot. To use a Buddhist term, inauspiciousness, that until that is fixed, there's going to be a lot of challenges because there's just so much importance about not making the people who are trying to be kind and generous to a community ask for their needs to be met. It's kind of they're the easiest people to take advantage of, and I think it's happening. So digression, but I think it was some kind of certainty is probably to answer your question, Zim. I think it was probably like going for something that where it's funny like where I had to think less. You know. Um, can I invite in Dr. Britton to because I mean I could try to explain it, but I would rather you say what's going on.
Sure. So, yeah, Cheetah House provides evidence-based education and support to people who have had, a range of different kinds of difficulties with meditation practice, different kinds of communities, other kinds of spiritual practice. Yeah, we have peer support. So almost everyone on our care team has had some kind of meditation crisis. We also have some clinicians, so you can have a one-on-one consult, or we also have support groups and some ongoing classes, and then we have these lectures. So a whole array of things. So yeah, if you want to come to the support group, all you need to do is make an appointment with any member of the care team to see if you're a good fit.
And again, I'm glad you asked that question, David, because
Thank you.
yeah, it's amazing to me again that there is virtually no one else doing this. Is there anyone else doing this? I don't think there is there?
We have a partner group in Germany because we mostly speak English. So for non-English speakers, there's a German one that's led by Ulrich Ott. And I think he's a clinician himself, and he takes some of the meditators. But I'm not sure if there's groups. I think it's just like a more like a place that where people can go for help and referral.
There's so much more meditation than there ever was before, and we're in this whole new era of like access and a lot of lack of guidance. And so one of the places where I think my evolving mission aligns with Cheetah House is like I've gotten to the point where I don't care about making anyone Buddhist. I don't think I ever wanted to like proselytize or anything, but I actually and I don't even know that I want to teach anybody to meditate. If somebody asks, I'll be there and I'm available and I'm equipped and I enjoy doing that, to be honest. But what I want to do is help people use meditation and Buddhism safely because people are gonna find meditations. They're gonna, we're in this era right now. I feel like it's kind of like we're in this era now where the pharmacy doors are wide open. They're like Denny's doors. They don't even have locks on them, and you can go in, you can grab anything you want just because of the color of the label. And it doesn't matter what dosage or what the indications are or what the contraindications are. And we're all just going in and running our arms down the shelves and taking whatever we can. And I think to varying degrees, that's how a lot of people are learning to meditate. And I think there's another issue there too, in terms of like learning from many different people, and you can put your meditations at cross purpose. So I want to say that one of the many things that I really benefited from in the Cheetah House community is the MyMap seminar, the My Meditation Assessment Process seminar. I would definitely recommend that because it was mind blowing to me to think about my meditation in terms of my goals, which is another reason why I have the 3-step process I gave you today to really think like right now, what's my goal and what meditation fits that. And then, two things that really stuck out to me from that I remember now are like number one, realizing that I ended up with a whole comprehensive worldview when I went in to learn to meditate. Like I literally just went in to learn to meditate. I went to the Buddhist center because I figured at the time I thought they've been doing it the longest, and I went and I walked into the shrine room and I saw all the colorful pictures of deities with 4 and 8 and 1,000 arms. And I was in this incredibly lit room with all these deities. And I said, yuck, please do not, I don't want anything to do with those. Just teach me to meditate. And 10 years later, I was in a retreat engaged exactly with those deities and as those deities. And it's not an awful thing that happened, but it was surprising to realize like it really snuck up on me. I did not realize I was developing and transforming my whole worldview in that way. And then the other thing that I got from that seminar was just the question of like, what if you have a certain goal that you're meeting with meditation, what other things also accomplish that goal? It's such a simple question, right? But like, and I think that also gets at the idea of, again, like I was here in the beginning of the talk, the idea of we all are practicing some kind of mindfulness or meditation. You don't have to call it that. If you hate that word, you don't have to use that word, but we're all in some way getting to know ourselves and how things work, what works for us, what doesn't. And being able to notice alternative ways of accomplishing goals is like really empowering. And so those were the two things that stuck up. Yes, Dr. Britton.
All right, this is going to be a little convoluted, but so as you know, many people that come to Cheetah House have been so traumatized that um, they don't really make amends with Buddhism or like continue practicing, or they really kind of deconvert and really sour on the entire experience, often become sort of anti-religious in every way. So, it's interesting to watch how you've kind of maneuvered in order to, keep doing what you do, or at least do it modify the way that you do it so that you continue to be a teacher and you continue to use, terms from, from Buddhism. And so, and we can talk about, how you separated out the Dharma and Buddhism, and that I see that as, one of your strategies. But the voice in my mind, and this is like my own, but also everyone else that I've talked to at Cheetah House, is like religions are not person-centered. Like by definition, they're not person-centered. Like you can't just
Agreed.
like, you know, and then a lot of people like get burned by this. They show up at at the Dharma Center and they're like, well, I'm doing it for this reason, and they get, put in line pretty quickly. So, and I think one way that you're getting around this is that, you are a Lama, you can teach your own thing and you can basically do it your way, which is person-centered. But like there is you are part of a structure, and there is definitely, I can tell you from experience, an old guard that's around. So how are you managing that? Do you have a Buddhist superego that's, you know, saying like, the word surrender is also like one of those things where like um surrender is like pretty much the antithesis of, person-centered approach. Like we don't care what you think. We don't care how you feel. Like, follow the rules, and like, getting rid of your ego is abdicating for, your own self needs. So there's a lot of things that are like in my opinion, kind of central to a lot of Buddhist ideas that are depriving people of agency. Um, and so, yeah, any of that, how do you navigate it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I 100% agree with you that religion is not person-centered. I totally 100% on track there. And I do feel like obviously it's a process that's ongoing. Like I have my own relationship with Buddhist beliefs, and a lot of that's personal. And I also have my own relationship with Buddhist teachers that I've had different issues with. The head of our lineage has had some accusations made that I'm not super happy about, but I have my own relationship there, and so there's a lot of things, in coming to do this talk and agreeing to do this talk and preparing this talk, like it helped me to realize that it doesn't really matter to me what the institution thinks about what I have to say or teach anymore to me. It matters a little bit in the sense of like I want to impact people in a positive way. And, probably the worst thing about stepping back from the Dharma Center was the impact I can have on people is like this compared to what it used to be. But I'm okay with that because I'm doing it in a healthy way, and I'm doing it in the way that I feel is authentic and right. But I had to kind of come to the point where I was like, I'm gonna teach what science is telling me is right, what my experience is telling me is right. And I really think that the Dharma is something we find in a person-centered way, and Buddhism is like a one size fits all technique. It's not one, it's one size fits many, but you're right. There is that sort of push to like get in line and you start to use language. I remember when I first started to say for the benefit of all beings, it's such a weird sentence, but it became like so like natural to me, like there's all these, and again, like language is one of the ways that cults kind of solidify stuff. And so I don't know, part of it is getting away from the language and just trying to find a more personalized approach. And I think I put this in the abstract. Like I really do feel like interacting with the nervous system is like the foundation of all of this. Like our relationship with our nervous system has to come first. And I don't have enough. I haven't thought it through enough, but I feel like there's something really big there that could be explained really well and at length around Buddhism, or at least to support the Dharma. But yeah, I mean, it is. I think there's also that's a dynamic complement, religion versus person-centered. Like we need organizations that can help individuals, and that means a big group that has to systematize some stuff. But um, but yeah, I don't know if I'm answering My answer was probably as convoluted as your question, but did I get at it? Is there other things you want to? Yeah,
I mean, since I'll just keep talking until
yeah,
someone
yeah.
raises their hand. But what I was thinking of is, so I'm an MBSR and MBCT teacher, and have done a lot with I know the manual by heart because I've taught in federal clinical trials. And one of the handouts, the only handout that they get on the first day, the participants, is a list of like negative thoughts about practice that you're basically like, if you have any of these thoughts, like you specifically need to dismiss them. And they're
Hmm.
like, basically all the signs that like this isn't right for me, like this is like my body's like, no, this isn't, this is not the time, this is not, and so like even in like MBSR and MBCT, like that we're talking about like the furthest secular, most medicalized version. It's like right there on the day on the first session. Like start, you know, dismissing your own body's signals. So I'm just, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
we have a
Well, and one other thing, because I know you mentioned ego. Like I've been thinking a lot about that lately because I did a great series. David Treleaven offered an IFS for TSM series seminar about internal family systems and trauma-informed mindfulness. And so it was neat for me to learn about internal family systems. I think it aligns with the Vajrayana view that, everything should be brought to the path, nothing is to be abandoned. And it got me thinking about this idea of ego and letting go of ego. And like, and particularly, like, I'm also teaching right now on a text that encourages repudiating ego, speaking very meanly to ego for all the things it does. And I realized, like, who am I talking to? Like, what am I talking to? Is it possible that when I'm repudiating ego, I'm taking friendly fire? Like I'm actually shooting at these important parts of me, and I've come to what I think is what we actually mean by ego, which is like the resistance to how things actually are. I don't think it's like a me situation or a part of me. It's more of a dynamic. But I've never heard anybody else really talk about it exactly that way. And I think a lot of times it's taught in such a way that we do end up using it as a way to shut down our self-awareness. And that's so tragic and ironic because like we're trying to cultivate self-awareness, but when we say, give up the ego, I think a lot of times people hear, well, the part of me that feels like I can't do this, or the part of me that feels angry, like I need to get rid of that, but that's the data, that's the raw material. And it's just tragic that we end up uh, sometimes dismissing that. Ani? Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it would differ depending on the communities, first of all. I also feel like it would definitely be an ongoing process that would probably be adjusted over time, just like people have statements about, codes of conduct for the community or things like that. But I think like a one dynamic that is key, I think, is not avoiding uncomfortable topics. There's just a lot of that in any spiritual or meditation community. And I think if we're able to talk about the fact, like for instance, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but like the dynamic complement of market driven versus mission driven. Like at a Dharma center, if you do the really rare Yamantaka empowerment, you're going to get all kinds of people coming in and you're going to make a lot of money for the center, which is great because we want to help people. But it's also like, do they need that? Is that something that they really need? And when we do 6 different deity practices in a week, people want to go to those practices for the community, but is it good for them to do 6 different practices as opposed to the one that's best for them? So I think just being able to talk about the fact and stay in a place of paradox and tension, and uncertainty, like that is so crucial. And I think that we try to avoid that so often. I think there should be a lot more difficult conversations in Dharma centers. And I think we should rumble. I think, is that a Brene Brown thing? Sorry. But like, yeah, we need to get in there and rumble, have these rumbles, like talk about the difficult stuff. And so I think the way it would look is both maybe some sort of statement, and just a new way of teaching, where we talk about the things that can go well and the things that can go wrong. And I think most importantly, how to know for yourself how to determine your own way of deciding, so because part of another dynamic complement here is like trusting people who have authority on something or maybe have had more experience and trusting your inner wisdom. So there always has to be some balance there. But I would say in Buddhist communities in particular, we're way too fixated on the perfection, the end of the path, the finality. And I think that ends up reinforcing this sense that like we need to talk to the people who are higher up, who have had more experience and are, they must know what I need because they're further towards that final goal. Whereas I think a much more person-centered approach, much more trauma-informed approach is to recognize that in every moment you can be awakened. And that's one of the best things my teacher ever told me too, was that like we need to like valorize these moments of presence, these moments of being present and okay. Number one, there's negativity bias that we all have, so we kind of tend to think about the bad stuff that happens. But the other thing is that like we can in any given moment be totally present, and I truly believe that we can behold nirvana in any given moment, and we just want to make those moments more often, and they matter. And like I think of this time when I was in Sedona and I was on this hike at the Cathedral Rock, and they have these energy vortexes there supposedly, and I was feeling amazing, and I was so present. And I wasn't a meditator at the time or anything. I didn't know what to call it, but I was like just totally there. It was amazing. And to me, that was one of those moments of awakening. I was present. I was right there. And that matters. That wasn't fake. That wasn't like partly there. That wasn't like a sign that the fact that it ended isn't a sign that I'm a bad person or a bad practitioner. I think we just need to really start to train ourselves to feel good about those moments when we do come into the present moment, which also means noticing the tensions, noticing the imbalances and being okay talking about them. And maybe even being okay talking about how your imbalance may not be my imbalance. And I just feel like we skip a whole lot of those things in Dharma communities, particularly because we all want to look dharmic. We want to look like we're, great practitioners or whatever. And so that's why I picked the name Dharma Deathmatch for my program that I'm doing. Like, let's get in there. This is going to be a little rough. Let's do it. So I hope that answers your question. Like it's not I think it's specific to each community, and I think it is both a matter of like compiling one thing, maybe that says all the stuff you want to stay across the board, but also it's a matter of responding to individuals in the moment in situations as they come up with a sense of uncertainty and curiosity and compassion. And I think that it's always going to be a work in progress. Thank you.
I think that's a good place to call it a wrap. Thank you so much, Adam. For you're all, when you leave, there's going to be an anonymous feedback survey. So if this talk spoke to you in any way, like please leave comments. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of other events that are coming up. So the next event is in August, and I'm actually conducting kind of the next varieties of contemplative experience study. It's a different kind. It's a different study, but it's huge, and it's going to answer all the questions that I still have. And so we're actively recruiting for that. So this is just a free information session about that study, which I'm doing with Roman Politsky at Emory. So check our events page for the details. In September, we have two talks. One is Joel Kruger, who is a philosopher who looks at scaffolding. He's actually the theory behind the scaffolding practice that we do. So if you're interested in scaffolding, come to that and learn about where it came from. He wrote a really important paper that I read, and that's how it started. And then later on in September, um, there's a guy named Pierce Salguero, and he basically is going to be presenting this book called Meditation Sickness, which is an edited volume of 25 chapters that are basically translations of Buddhist textual sources that are about meditation sickness or problems that arise in meditation. So the point is that this is not a new thing that like Americans just can't meditate or like, they don't do it right anymore. Like this is a well-known phenomenon that Buddhists have been writing about for millennia. It's just that we don't have a lot of the texts haven't been translated into English, and so there's actually not as much information as there should be out there. And so now there is, it's because it's in English. And I have a chapter in there that's actually three cases from the varieties of contemplative experience study. Like the whole interview is in there. We wanted to make sure that we had, the long piece, not just the excerpts. So that's a very important talk. Please come if you can make it. And again, just check our events page, and if you want to just be told in your email and reminded, just sign up. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter. Thank you so much for coming, and see you next time.